can withstand the impact of a bullet and cut it clean in half. You can bend and twist the blade and still have enough left over to cut you in half. It can cut off your head in one swing. It can go through flesh, bone, tissue, like a piece of paper. It's sharp, it's flexible, and extremely deadly. It may be the greatest weapon created by man. It has a name, the samurai sword, the sword of Japan. In our modern world, the samurai sword is a myth or a legend. It conjures up the image of warriors battling to the death for honor, for glory, for their master. But few people can tell the difference between the fact and the fiction involving the samurai sword. However, we hope today to teach you where it came from, how it was made, what makes it unique, and hopefully separate some of the facts from the fiction.
The history of the samurai sword is linked eternally to the identity of Japan. The samurai sword is the soul of the samurai and also the heart of Japan. The sword is so connected to the samurai that even in death, it is buried together. As important as the mythology of the samurai is, let me tell you of the story of Amukane, the father of the samurai sword. Amukane and his son Amikura were head smiths, otherwise sword makers, assigned by the Emperor of Japan himself. They only had one job, and that was to make swords for his army. One day after returning from battle, the Emperor and his army marched past Amukane's house with their heads down and not a single word being said. No sign of speaking or greeting him, which they usually do. Amukane's heart stopped after seeing the swords of the Emperor's army. They were shattered and broken. With great shame, Amukane and his son locked themselves into their foraging chamber and prayed to their god Comm for inspiration. And on the seventh day and night, they both had a shining image of this single-edged, slightly curved blade, and as soon as they could, they began to make the exact creation of this weapon. The next day, each knowing what they had to do, they began creating the weapons. When Amukane first presented his swords to the Emperor, the other smiths thought of him as a joke, and they thought that he was just trying to get the favor of the Emperor. But being a kind Emperor, he accepted the newly and improved weapons for his army, and Amukane was delighted when he saw that after the war, none of his weapons were shattered, not even broken. However, many of the other smiths' swords were broken.
Amukane and his son started the Japanese forgers and smiths and metallurgists on a 300-year trek to create what we would now call the samurai sword. It took them 300 years to perfect it to the exact dream of Amukane and his son. The metal used to forge the samurai sword is a very unique and quite special blend of metal. It has both high and low carbon steel in it. It combines the great attributes of both types of metal without any of the weaknesses. It is the only sword to be able to do this in the entire world and in the entire existence of mankind creating weapons. High carbon steel is a metal that allows the blade to be extremely sharp and very strong. However, when it's impacted, it breaks. A big problem in battle when you want to defend yourself. Low carbon steel, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. It doesn't break on high impact, but it does not hold a blade. This creates a problem. So the samurai sword is a combination of both. It is strong and flexible, yet it will not break, but it will hold a great edge, and it is the sharpest sword in the world. The metal used to forge the Japanese samurai sword is using a very specific forging technique called tatra. This technique does not use iron ore as many other processes do. It actually uses an iron powder collected from the beaches and rivers of the Japanese coastline. Tatra adds carbon to the iron powder via the lighting of the wood underneath it to heat the dust. The dust is then turned into a large clump of metal, which smiths knock off pieces and bits to make their swords. At the end of the process, the low and high carbon steel bits will be brought to a swordsmith, and he will choose between them to find the best pattern that will make his samurai sword. With his unique creation of steel, he would take the low carbon and high carbon steel and combine them individually and then fold them up to 10 times to give them extra strength, to make the blade stronger and give it that beautiful wave pattern that you see when you get up close to the blade. The swordsmith would then create a katana shell out of the high carbon steel and then place the low carbon steel in the groove as to combine the two metals and their properties. Now this will be then hammered together. Doing this will allow the blade to have two shells, an outer shell that is hard and creates the blade, and an inner shell that acts as a shock absorber, thus creating the blade that will slice through anything. The quenching process is important, not just because it adds the curve to the samurai sword, but it's a very dangerous time for the smith, because he knows that 2/3 of his swords will not make it past this process due to the bending and the change in temperature between the water and the blade. As it bends, it runs a risk of cracking and breaking. The master will pull the sword out of the fire red hot and dip it into water, and thus quench it. Once the blade is in the water, it will start to curve, creating the famous samurai shape. It will get the curve at the end of the blade, which will make the slicing better and make the sword that much more deadly. Now that the blade has been built, has been created, it's on to the last stages of sharpening, polishing, adding a sheath, and adding a handle. After that, it becomes what we call a samurai sword.
Many things you hear about samurai swords sounds like fiction, but in reality, they are fact. The sword was developed in such a way that it can be carried with the blade facing upward, so that it can be drawn quickly and slashing and all in one motion. Strong enough to penetrate a vehicle. It took a 50 caliber machine gun to destroy the sword. After the 6th bullet, the sword finally shattered. Yes, a steel chair also falls victim to the katana sword. The samurai sword stands unparalleled among all other swords that make up the Japanese history. The samurai sword was used on prisoners to test the sharpness of the blade. It can also deflect arrows and split them in half. Death is a punishment to people who have samurai swords and who aren't samurais. That's me. But if you was to touch a samurai sword, you could also lose your life. It took 15 people 6 months to create this sword.
The facts we've listed, we hope, have taught you where the samurai sword came from, how it was used, how it shaped the nation, and what makes up a samurai sword. We hope that it inspires you to read more about this great weapon. It not only has a great history, has a great process of being created, but it has stuff in it that no other sword in the world will ever have.